This is it, the final video for the year. Welcome to the grand finale of our 2024 Style Study Month. And there's a reason I saved this one for the very end, you guys, because this one is a bit of a doozy. Today we're going so far out of our comfort zone that we're not even looking at character art. Today we are looking at some beautiful, vibrant, super stylized landscape paintings. And what better sense of inspiration than this incredible artist? Today we are looking at the amazing, magical works of Arina Konstantinova, better known by her online name, TEKTOBER. Before we dive in, I just want to say I hope you guys are having the most wonderful holiday season if you celebrate, and if you don't celebrate, I hope you're having a wonderful week regardless. I hope you found some reason to spread a little joy and cheer this year, and if you haven't, then this right here, we're celebrating together. This absolutely counts. If this is your very first style study, hi, welcome! My name is Srish and I'm so glad you're here because today we're going to level up your art by like 1,000,000%. Style Study is a regular series we do here on my channel where we take a look at some of our favourite contemporary artists, analyse their work and see what we can learn from it. Keyword, learn. We're not here to plagiarise anyone's work or copy their style. We're simply here to learn some really cool art tips and tricks and see how we can apply them to finding our own unique art style. I usually structure my style studies in 3 parts. In part 1, we'll take a look at Arina's work, analyse her style and see what we can learn from it. Part 2 will be a study of one of her original paintings. The stunning reference I've chosen today is this one. And in part 3 we'll apply everything that we learned today to an original painting of our own. This one was a tough one, you guys, so bear with me. As always, if you enjoy this video and learned something today, please do remember to let me know by giving it a big thumbs up and hitting that subscribe button down below. Comment below your biggest takeaway from this study and come say hello on social media. All my links are in the description. Alrighty, for the very final time this year, if you're ready, grab a snack, sit back, and let's dive into another style study featuring TEKTOBER. Arina Konstantinova is a 26-year-old concept artist and illustrator from Serbia who specializes in these incredibly dramatic, stylized fantasy landscape paintings. She works freelance and has previously worked with companies like Strange Horizons, Huion, Kaspersky, and Pixelmator, among others. Her absolutely stunning art has garnered her over 92.3 thousand followers on Instagram and over 2.6 thousand followers on Twitter. Like I said, Arina specializes in these super vibrant, super stylized landscapes that feature vivid, saturated color palettes on what would otherwise be a fairly realistic looking scene. You have elements of very dramatic lighting, but what I'm most excited to dive into today is the incredible shape language in the rendering. If I had to really explain the style in the simplest way possible, her art almost feels like children's illustrations, but for grown-ups. So there is very much that whimsy of color and simplicity of composition, but there is also a lot of sophistication in the rendering and the storytelling. But despite the colors and the drama and the fantasy elements, at the very core of Arina's work is always a beautiful landscape. Under all the layers of design, her art is very much naturalist. Speaking of lists, here are 4 key characteristics to Arina's art. The color story in every one of Arina's paintings makes my heart sing, because holy guacamole are these some vibrant colors. There is extreme saturation in pretty much every painting, and it's not just at the focal point or as an accent tone. The saturation is absolutely global and uniform across the scene. So like in this scene here, you obviously have the extremely bright saturated yellow right at the focal point where the sun is setting. And right under that, you have a hot orange. And then you have a layer of pink and purple, which get a little less saturated, but are still visibly vibrant. And then that super blue in the sky and the yellow-green in the ground. It's like concentric rings of color around the light source. Now, obviously, these are not very natural colors you'd see in an IRL scene, even at sunset. You might see similar hues in real life, but it's never these values and saturation. So, despite the compositional elements generally indicating a realistic scene, Arina uses the color palette to really elevate her landscapes beyond realism. As far as the lighting is concerned, Arina very much sticks to a singular light source, generally a bright sun or moon, but just like with the colors in the scene, the physics of the light source don't always follow the laws of realism. So while the sun is usually quite a bright directional light, especially when it's setting like it seems to be here, it doesn't necessarily cast long, dramatic, directional shadows. Like, here's the photo Arina roughly based this piece on, where you see these super dark values caused by both ambient occlusion and drop shadows. But in the painting, you have a lot of brightness, very much a significant amount of ambient light, and you don't really see dramatic drop shadows due to, say, the power poles or even the bus. At least not the long directional shadows that you should see at sunset. Then you have pieces like this one, where the moon is the primary light source, but our IRL moon simply doesn't cast nearly this much light. It is severely cool and really dramatizes and elevates the entire scene, taking it up to fairy tale status. As far as the palette is concerned, it almost feels complementary and also analogous, if that makes sense. So rather than just sticking to direct complementary tones as the hero elements, Arina actually picks complementary color spectrums. So here, while the main tone is yellow, which would make the complementary tone purple, there's a spectrum that goes from yellow all the way to blue. So yellow to orange to red to pink to purple to blue. Here, the main color is this pale, saturated teal, meaning the complement should lie somewhere in the peachy red zone. And then you have the entire spectrum that goes from teal to blue to indigo, purple, pink, and then the peachy red tone. And this inclusion of the entire spectrum of colors between two complementary tones is what creates a harmonious palette, despite the colors being so incredibly saturated. Generally speaking, Arina sticks to a pretty simple single point perspective for the vast majority of her scenes. The point of convergence is usually at the vertical halfway point of the scene or lower down, but you very rarely have a very high up horizon line. This simplicity of perspective is what gives you that children's illustration-y vibe, in my opinion, because it really helps streamline the storytelling. It's really easy in a scene like this to see all the elements here, see how they interact, and how they fit into the grand scheme of the story. Like here, for instance, you see a character walking across a rickety bridge that passes through a crescent moon. There's traffic lights and windmills on either side of the bridge. There are some mountains in the distance and what looks like a fiery sunset and massive clouds that rise up from the horizon. Here's an even less realistic scene. You have a sunset and what looks like a light ring around the sun. Then you have this crazy massive jellyfish in the sky floating about the water, and the foreground features a character who is watching the sunset and a cat who is reaching out, presumably to slap a baby jellyfish, because that seems like a cat thing to do. The point is, despite the piece being so full of so many storytelling elements, the simple perspective allows you to read the scene quickly and easily. Sometimes, however, Arina goes for a more complex three-point perspective, like in this painting here. See how the trees seem to almost tower over you, the viewer? Same thing here, where the suspension cables on either side of the bridge seem to almost fly over your head. I find that she uses these more complex perspective setups on scenes that have much simpler story. Like this scene isn't anything crazy, it is a static bamboo forest. However, due to the perspective, suddenly it isn't just a 2D painting. It's like you're thrown into the scene and the trees are towering over you. The perspective is used to add dynamism to scenes where the story is fairly static and simplistic, but then there's another layer. Because you know how these trees and poles and cables seem to tower over you, the viewer? It is created with the intention of making you feel rather small. Like the scene is larger than life, almost dangerously so. And boom, suddenly you are part of the story. And storytelling doesn't really get much more dynamic than when you, the viewer, are in it. The way Arina renders her forms and textures is like a flat 0.5. So there's a lot of flat shapes, but it isn't like entirely flat. Let me explain. The vast majority of the dimension and form is made up of flat shapes with no blending. So if we zoom in here, the clouds have 4, maybe 5 colors all overlaid on top of each other, separated by very hard edges. The trees are made of a couple of colors, as is the grass and pavement. Arina doesn't render form with tons of realism, it is all implied shapes and textures, and pretty much all objects in the scene are rendered like this, with a couple of colors and hard edges. In fact, you'll see that the number of colors determines the softness of the material that she paints. So with the clouds, like we saw, there's quite a few colors. You have your brightest highlight tone here and your deepest shadow tone here, and there's like 5 intermediate tones, plus extra ambient colors from the blue sky. Leaves are another soft element, and so here you see like 6 or 7 different colors in here, going from the brightest tone right around that star to the darkest tone in the background. With harder structures, however, you'll see that the intermediate tones show planes but not form. So with the buildings here, each face of the building is its own flat color, but you won't see hard-edged intermediate tones within a face. Here in the wood, in the trees, there's a few different colors, yes, but they aren't intermediate tones. The plane shifts are very harsh. In other words, there aren't any colors to soften the shift from light to dark. So rather than using photo textures or texture brushes or even painting realistic textures by hand, Arina gives everything the flat, hard edge treatment, but uses the presence or absence of intermediate tones to distinguish between hard and soft textures.
Now, this is where the 0.5 comes in, because there are in fact some softer tone shifts in Arina's paintings, particularly when it comes to the airbrushed light overlays. More often than not, these are warm blooms of colour overlaid on top of the rendering to create these beautiful, whimsical spots of glow, and these are usually placed right around the magical or fantasy elements that Arina paints. So now let's take a look at the final punch-up details. In order to really seal the deal on how whimsical these paintings really are, Arina adds a touch of magic by painting in magical elements. The most frequent one is obviously the oversized moon. Be it a crescent or a full moon, this massive element is generally the source of light and the primary focal point in a lot of her work. And not only is the massive size of it unrealistic, but for the most part, the moon tends to cast a very warm glow. Obviously, our actual moon tends to cast a cooler, silvery glow, so this one definitely adds an extra element of fantasy. A lot of the times, you'll also see these leaking light streams flowing out of the moon, like little rivulets of glowy light pouring out onto the clouds or down into the sea. Obviously, there's a metaphor there since the moon controls our tides, so that's pretty cool. The clouds themselves are usually extremely dramatic, especially the ones directly around the sun or the moon. Obviously, we saw they have lots of intermediate, saturated colors, but in terms of the shape language, these clouds are probably the most dramatic silhouette of all, and tend to cover the vast majority of the sky. Then there's the random little streaks of light, most often in the sky, sometimes at ground level, emulating little shooting star trails, or maybe like the motion of lightning bugs. And finally, and arguably the most important of all, we have the light explosion. This is usually, but not always, right around the sun or the moon, but you'll see this extremely bright, warm explosion of yellow right at the primary light source that illuminates the area directly around it, usually the clouds. Like here, where this setting sun creates a fiery yellow and orange aura in the clouds, which then gradually goes purple and then the blue of the sky. Here, the glow is gentler, it goes from yellow to a muted orange, then a grey, and then the purple of the water. However, notice how, although the light source might brighten up the entire scene, it doesn't necessarily colour the scene. In real life, the colour of anything we see depends entirely on the light source. Bright daylight shows us the full spectrum of colour, and so we can tell the true colour of any object. But when the light source is especially warm, it colours everything to be much warmer. And if the light source is especially cool, it'll colour everything to be especially cool. We all know this instinctively, and our brains often colour adjust by default in order to account for the colour of the light source. So when in Arina's work we see these extremely warm light sources that colour their immediate surroundings, but then we also see these super saturated blues, greens and purples, it sort of messes with our minds in that it almost doesn't seem plausible. The real life elements of nature are right there, they make sense, even if we stretch our imagination a little, but there is a deeper, permeating sense of this doesn't come from our world. Since these colour stories don't quite align with what our visual library says about the reality around us. And that right there is the biggest and most powerful element of fantasy in every single one of Arina's paintings. It's like a window into worlds that are so intrinsically different to our own. Man, it must be such a gift to live in a mind like hers. So, to sum up part one of this study, Here are 4 key characteristics to Arina Konstantinova's work. Number 1, the super vivid, extremely saturated colors elevate a simple landscape with one light source into a dramatic, vibrant scene. The color palettes are usually complementary and analogous, pretty much covering an entire half of the color wheel. 2, Arina usually sticks to a single point perspective in order to tell stories a lot easier, though a more complex, dynamic perspective setup generally adds a lot of dynamism to otherwise static scenes. 3, the rendering is usually made of very flat, hard-edged shapes, and texture determines how many intermediate transition tones she uses on each material. And number 4, Arina uses magical elements like a giant moon, shooting stars, and rivulets of light to create a sense of fantasy to truly punch up an otherwise realistic composition. For our study today, this is the reference I've chosen. Usually I put a lot of thought into choosing a reference because it needs to be a good representation of the artist's style without being so complex that I can't actually paint it. But with this one, it was literally just gut instinct. The second I saw this painting, I knew it had to be the one. It started with a super rough sketch, just approximating the overall shapes and sizes of things. I mean, this was a challenge from the very beginning because these are not shapes I draw very often. This is not the kind of compositions that I'm used to. It was definitely a bit of a challenge trying to figure out where to begin, so I decided to literally build this one up from the ground up. I ended up spending a lot of time working and reworking the clouds because, again, these are not shapes that I'm used to. And because everything is rendered to have hard edges, it was also very much a challenge to go through and decide which lines would actually need to be drawn and which ones I could just skip over. Next, it was time to color block. I used the reference in my Pure Ref window as a guide and coloured in the biggest silhouettes, just so everything is neatly on its own layer. So the sky, the clouds, the grass, the house and the moon got their own layers. Having everything isolated like this allows us to lock transparency or use clipping masks in order to make sure that we're colouring within the lines. And since this style is so deeply rooted in hard edges and clean shapes, we want to be extra careful with that sort of thing. I started with the grass since that was probably the easiest shape of all. And maybe like 4 tones, I used a lasso select tool for the brightest yellows because I needed sharp corners for that bit. And then the darker tones I just freehanded. I also carved in the little path before moving on to the house. Now remember, harder surfaces have little to no intermediate transition tones to go from light to shadow. So this bit was actually pretty simple, just making lasso selections and painting the shapes in. I'm gonna be honest you guys, the rendering was actually really easy here, but I suspected that it was because all the thinking had already been done for me. And my suspicions were definitely confirmed when it came time for the original painting, but we'll get to that in just a little bit. I also quickly blocked in the little cyclist character. The great thing about this style is that since the palette is very strongly analogous, a lot of the colors are repetitive. So instead of having to color match every single tone for every single element, once I had a couple of things down, I could just easily color pick. And now the mammoth task of painting the clouds. I actually started by creating a little color palette on a new layer. Since the clouds are soft and have a ton of intermediate colors, and like I just said, a lot of the colors are repetitive, having a palette down to begin with really helped me focus more on just the shapes. I started with that weird penguin shaped cloud up top. Does anyone else see a penguin there? Just me? But anyway, it was the easiest one, so I got it out of the way. Now the work begins. Again, I wasn't sure where to begin. I just picked a random shadowy tone and just got started with it. And turns out that was absolutely the way to go. Thanks, artistic instinct. So it turns out starting with a shadow tone really allows you to gradually build up the midtones and highlights. Because if you look at the shape language, the highlight shapes are definitely the fullest, roundest shapes. Like there aren't any other tones laying over the highlights. So instead of putting those down first and then working the midtones around them, it just makes more sense to build them on top. I went ahead and painted the rest of the clouds in the same way, starting with the shadow and then building up to the highlights. And finally, we get to do the super fun, magical, glowy bits. I started by first painting in all the large stars and any little light rivulets, since these are just flat shapes, and then using an airbrush and a new layer set to overlay blending mode, I went ahead and just hand painted in the glow around the moon and the stars. Remember, we also want to brighten up the clouds that are directly next to the moon, and it turned out so lovely. I really enjoyed the process of painting this. It was a lot more straightforward to study than I'd feared. Now for the bit I did not love so much, painting the original. Thing is, I usually like to start a painting with a base idea of the story that I want to tell and then just let the character take over. But with the landscape, oh boy, the juices were not juicing. And I feel like with Arina's style, the more clarity of vision you have right from the get-go, the better your end product is going to turn out. So starting out with a vague idea for a cool fountain and maybe just a large sun setting behind it was certainly not the way to go. This painting went through like a million changes, and while I'll show you guys the essential bits here, I'll put the entire thing on Patreon because it will make this video like an hour long if I showed you every change I had to make. This one was a mess. Yeah, I had this idea of maybe like the shrubs on either side of the river having these gigantic roses, but halfway through trying to render said roses, I realized I absolutely do not like painting flowers, even in my own style, which is overly complex. So trying to paint them in a style where you need to tell the most with the least amount of shapes was just not gonna happen, okay? I'm sorry. Ignore all the clouds and the fountains that you see, none of them made it into the painting. I just decided at this point to dive into the leafy bits. I knew I wanted the key light to lie right where that fountain is, so the brightest shapes would have to be facing that general direction. Dude, this was so much harder without a reference to study. My suspicions were 100% correct. Then I decided to just do away with the fountain because there was so much going on, and instead do little rivulets of light coming down from that round portal looking thing. I then got rid of the flowers, changed up the entire color scheme, and decided to go much darker. That way the glowy rivulets would really pop. And I once again did away with the clouds and decided to go much more muted with the sky to begin with. Now it's all starting to come together. Only took like all of my brain cells. I promise you, this is not a critique of the style at all. I mean, who the hell am I to critique Arina? Her work is so incredibly good. No, this is a critique of my skill, or lack thereof. Like, I knew landscapes don't come easily to me, but I didn't know just how big a gap there was in my skill set until I studied the style. And I think the gap is more in my inability to imagine landscapes as opposed to actually like painting skills. Because like I said, rendering in this style is actually quick and easy if you know what you're doing. I think the end product turned out alright, not remotely my best work, but I also do really need to learn to paint environments in the new year. What do you think?
And there we have it, TEKTOBER demystified. You guys, this one took every last ounce of brain power I had, and I know it was very, very different to what we usually pick, but I hope you've learned something and enjoyed it regardless. I have, of course, linked all of Arina's work down in the description. Make sure you go check her out and show her some love for me. And if you've enjoyed this video and learned something today, make sure to show me some love as well by giving it a big thumbs up and subscribing to my channel. Comment below your biggest takeaway from this study and any other artists you'd like to see a style study on in the future. And I just want to take a moment today to say thank you so much for being here with me all through this year. We made it. This has been a tough year, and it has definitely been the toughest year that I've ever been through, and I'm sure it's been the same for a lot of you guys. But I am so proud of you for making it through. I'm so proud of us, and I am so grateful that you've been here this whole time, especially those of you who have supported me on things like Patreon, through commissions, and just by letting the ads play on my channel. Your support means the entire world to me, and I'm just so grateful to be able to spend a little bit of time with you every single week all through this year. I hope you have the most wonderful end of the year, and I hope you take some time for yourself to recharge and reset before we dive into the new adventure in January. That's what I'm gonna do, is I'm gonna take some time away as usual and just get myself together and get my foundations right, because there's already a bunch of ideas I want to dive into in the new year, and I can't wait to share them with you. I'll be back before you know it. And that's about everything for this video, you guys. So thank you so much for hanging out with me today and through this entire year. I truly do hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. As always, you can check out more style studies down here. Happy Style Study Month. And I'll see you guys on the next one. Bye!